Welcome back to episode 7 of Pocket Investor, where I, SolidusCode, builds Pocket Investor, a software as a service real estate investment calculator tool for new to seasoned real estate investors to be able to analyze property deals at scale. We're talking about being able to analyze 1, 2, 3 as many properties as you want in very quick succession to figure out whether a deal is a deal or whether it's just a dud. And while I'm building this great service, I want to bring you along for the ride to see exactly how it's done so that there's complete transparency in the process. In the last episode, I was working on the user authentication process and I had some minor hiccup. However, in this episode, there's been a lot of enhancements that I am just excited to share with you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So here we are with Pocket Investor. There's been a lot of enhancements overall that is just too long to enumerate. So I just think it's going to be better for me to just kind of walk you through the implementation, and as relevant, I'll show the code base supporting some of the stuff I've implemented. All right, so kicking off the demonstration for Pocket Investor. So first thing we'll do is create a user. So upon hitting the sign up button as part of this form, this submission function will then be called, where we're going to prevent the default form submission and just go ahead and handle it ourselves by taking this newly constructed user from the form and then sending that as part of an API fetch request to go ahead and post this over to this API endpoint, which is defined under my server API user and then sign up page. And then which then goes ahead and sends it to a function that's defined called sign up. So once that's done, an object is returned back that typically looks like this. Here, making sure that that return value was successful. And if so, I'll use a Vue3 composable to create a notification system to the user to let them know that everything worked out. And this use notification composable is new. It's defined right here. And in its essence, it's expecting an object to be passed in that has a key for title and content, which is going to be displayed to the user, and optionally a delay amount of time for it to stick around in terms of that notification. And then it's making sure that there is a HTML element that's on the page called notifications. Or if it doesn't exist, we'll go ahead and create it dynamically. And then we'll construct our new notification by creating a new div and inserting an H3 tag in there for the title. If the user did pass the title in, we'll be creating a button with an SVG X icon, and then we'll be inserting our content at the end of the notification. Then for this, we'll go ahead and add some classes to this notification that we just created, and then basically use this function as a way to time out and close it out. And then finally use a momentary delay and go ahead and then make the message appear to the user. When we run that, a notification gets displayed to the user. So with that, I'll go ahead and create this new user, user 8. After a successful sign up, we should be navigated over to sign in page. And so that was successful. So now let's go ahead and log this user in and sign in. I feel like this is a good place for me to talk about Pocket Investor's Nux 3's middleware for route middlewares. So here I've taken the liberty to write 2 route middlewares. These are going to be functions that are ran each time a user goes from one page to the next. And I want to talk about it here because by talking about the route middlewares, it allows me to further talk about additional Vue3 composables that I created, which is going to be use user token, use sfetch. I think that's it. So like I said, middlewares are ran each time the user navigates from one page to the next. So when I was coming from the sign up page to the sign in page, this function was ran because this is a global middleware. And you can tell that because there's this appendage of .global for it to be ran on every single route. Whereas here for auth middleware, this is only ran if, for example, on specific pages, which is going to be the user pages, a defined page meta property set. If this property is set, then this specific middleware, which is going to be represented here, will then be called prior to navigating and landing on this page here. So for all pages under this route, I will have this always defined and have this property defined. So what this function is doing is allowing me to check to see if the user is logged in or not by checking to see if the user cookie is present. And if it's not present, we kick them back over to the sign in page to go ahead and sign in. At the same time, if that cookie does exist, we go ahead and post to the backend server saying, hey, can you verify this token to make sure it's still valid? And if it's not valid, we go ahead and say, yet again, user, please go sign in. And the token is valid. We go ahead and say, hey, can we go ahead and get the list of links should be displayed here for this user? And that's important because based off of the user's specific role, I want to be able to give them different types of links. So now it's time to talk about use user token and use as fetch. Both of these are Vue 3 composables. And so I will start off with the use user token. This is basically a way to interact with Nux 3's use cookie system. With this line, I'm asking Nux 3 to check to see if a cookie called tokens exists. And then if it does, go ahead and return that value to me. At the same time, if this happens to be a value that's passed in, then I'll go ahead and set token to this new value. But if it's not provided, therefore, if this is indeed undefined, then I'll just go ahead and return the value of whatever the current value for this token cookie happens to be. So I thought this would be a useful composable to have so I don't have to write each of this line every time that I want to check the user's access token. So now use as fetch is a super handy wraparound for the common function fetch within Nux 3. You'll recall that in the signup function, we have the fetch command that takes in a URL and then a large object. And then we go ahead and wait for a response and convert that response over to JSON. And then finally do something with it. Well, I don't want to have to type this out every single time. I want to just kind of condense it down and just pass in the data points of the URL and the object and then get back this. And so in essence, I took all of this and slapped it into a composable function where I'm getting the URL and then a large object that represents what I want to send over to the server. And of course, I'm checking to see if the method for the API request is set, whether it's a get, post, delete, puts, and things like that. The default is always going to be a post. And then here I'm checking to see, if I happen to pass in a body or if I pass in a data or D. In either case, I'll just go ahead and default and take those, whether it's D or data, and pass it over to options.body so that for any post request, a body is always consistently defined. And then because I will be working with taking the user's JWT, JSON Web Token, and passing over to the server each time so the server knows who is making a particular request, I'll be creating a header as part of the options that I'll be passing in. And then this header will have a default content type that's going to be JSON. And then from here, I'll be setting the headers. And of course, here's the lovely token that we need with the composable user token that we just talked about. And now finally here we have the fetch command that I'm wrapping around. And then finally getting that results by awaiting its response. And then this is an application-specific logic that I implemented for my use case, which is going to be that if the server responds back with a instruction to redirect the user to a particular page for whatever reason, I handle that here on the front end by then changing the routes to push to a different location. So that's great now, but there's an equally interesting area that I spent a great deal of time within. And I really want to show that off. So to accomplish that, I'll go ahead and sign out as this user and then sign back in as the very first user that has administrative rights. All right, so off the bat, we see that we have a new link here. So because this particular user has the super user role, the admin role, a lot of different roles, they have elevated access. And so this link is going to be for managing the different settings for the service for PocketInvestor. So we'll have options that represents the site's name, the site description, contact us information, a set of default roles to assign whoever signs in, some data types. Then we have different sets of roles that exist. And then there are actions that dictate what can a user do or can't do. And for each of these actions, we can come back and tie a action with a role to say that a super user can have these types of capabilities that then, once we click that button, we can go ahead and open to see all the list of possible actions that this particular super user can perform. And as we compare that to a regular user, we'll see that a regular user can manage their own account only, so they have a limited set of actions they can perform. So for all of this, what I did first was create an STabs component that takes in an array of objects. Each is going to have a name field, a title, an active, an API. And so we v-model this to make sure that whenever the active state changes, the different tabs changes to the next one. And as we change from one tab to the next, the tab that's open gets called with this method called openIt. And then as well as for closing the method. Taking a peek at the definition, we basically just have an unordered list that loops through and displays the respective tabs. Then as each one is clicked, we loop through the object and then signal, hey, it's been clicked on, which is just saying open. As well, when something was previously open, we then tell it that we need to go and then close it out. And so while we have these tabs, we'll be able to then pass in a slot component so that the content for the tabs gets rendered out with the respective actual content for each of these. And so that's what we're having here by saying vslot, the content's name, as well as the tab's name. And then we display the body of the content here. So jumping real quick to when the tab is opened on this page, in essence, we're saying, hey, okay, if the tab is valid and has an API route, so go ahead and fetch what's at that endpoint and then return it back to the user. And for each of the array of data that's returned, we're going to set a property called selected, is so that I'll be able to come into any one of these and say, whenever I click on this, set selected to true so that I can edit this and then show out all this UI interface to be able to input some values. And then when I'm done, it'll set selected to false so that this could be hidden once more. And the same thing is repeated here, whereas if I edit here, I can display this and then done. So that's what this is achieving. And then I then set the respective values for the reference objects per here in accordance with the tab names. And so when each options or roles or tabs is basically being saved, we then go ahead and tell the server, hey, go ahead and save changes regarding API apps and options or roles or actions. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the server's backend to check out how some of these are being implemented. So to do that, I go to server and then API, and I check out some of these areas. But first, again, let's start back with middlewares. Now on this time, we're going to be checking out the middleware for the server. So whenever a new request comes to the server, whether it's get, puts, deletes, what have you, we are going to be calling these middleware functions. So the first one that I have, it goes ahead and sets on the request object. It sets the cookies by using use cookies and then setting this appropriately. I also make sure I have queries available so that I can, interact with those very easily. And then if the request method, once converting into lowercase, is actually a post, then I make sure to set a body for the request. Now, previous in Nux 2, you had these already made for you. However, in Nux 3, you have to kind of do this. So that's why I have this middleware to do this. This was a test that does nothing really at this point. I should just delete it. And here's another interesting tidbit. So I have a middleware that automatically converts the token from the request. It basically takes the token or the request, extracts out the token string value, and then verifies that. And of course, we know that with verify JWT function here, all I'm doing is decoding the JWT and then returning back what was previously encoded. So again, with this middleware, I take the request, or if this happened to be a token, I take that and decode it back to the user. And then on this request object, I set user to the actual decoded user, or I set it to null. And if it happens to be -1 as a value returned back here, it means per my system that the access token is expired. And so I go ahead and return this back to the front end to be able to redirect the user back into the sign-in page. And so this is an interesting piece here. I'm defining a function that allows me to seamlessly check whether a specific user, whoever is making a particular request, can perform a particular action by action name or by action ID. So you'll recall I have actions in my database tables and I have roles in my database tables as well. And then under capabilities is where the two have a solid marriage together. And so we are checking to see if a particular action, in this case edit options, or if it's edit permissions, is associated with a particular role. And so these two are being kind of checked together. So that is the point of this function. Basically asks a question, can a particular user perform a particular action? So to answer that question, I implemented a method under the users module that says, give me a user ID or name, or give me an action ID or name. And I'll be able to answer the question of whether or not there is an association between that user and an approved role that has the capability to perform a particular action. So here I'm creating a bunch of variables that references the database.table, so I don't have to manually enter this every single time. And then I'm creating a bunch of concatenated SQL strings that basically aims to answer this question. So all this boils down to this SQL statement here. So basically I'm trying to select any record within the capabilities table where the action ID is in here and the role ID is in here. And so for the action ID, because the ID can be a number or it could just be the straight name for the action, I'm going ahead and saying select some ID from actions whereby the ID is equal to whatever integer value or string this happens to be. In this case, it's not going to be a number. So instead it checks to see, or if the name is like manage roles. And then if there's something that matches that, then it returns that and passes it over to actions. And the same thing is happening for the role ID. I select, okay, is the role ID from the capabilities table, is that within a match for selecting from the user's role? So the user's role is here where I have some user who has an associated set of roles tied to that particular user. So the user number one has all these sets of roles assigned to them. So I'm checking to make sure that that user role is in the selected role ID from the user's roles table, where again, another subquery where the user ID is within here that says the user ID for 1 or the name is equal to 1. So if all that is satisfied, then we return at least one record that matches capabilities. If at least one record exists, then we know that the user has the capability to perform the action in question. So with that done, I basically then return back and make it a handler function here so that regardless of what routes that we're hitting, we can always say request.can user perform some action to make sure. So can we wait to make sure the user can manage roles? And if they cannot, then we just go ahead and return and exit. Otherwise, we allow the user to perform the action that they are requesting. And so that brings us back to this page. So if somehow a user manages to land on this page when they're not supposed to, they're not going to be able to add actions or delete actions or edit actions, or the same for roles and such, if they don't have the associated permission. As you can see, there's a lot of functional implementation within this episode. And that's even me purposely cutting some things out to try to save some time. But most of all, I'm very appreciative of you making it this far in the video. It means a lot to me. If you did enjoy this content, go ahead and let me know by hitting the like button. And at the same time, if you haven't already subscribed, what are you waiting for? My name is SolidusCode. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.